Resident Evil didn't just create survival horror, it redefined what fear in gaming could be. From its claustrophobic corridors to its action-heavy reinventions, this franchise has evolved horror in ways that most games could only hope to replicate. But what is it that makes Resident Evil so scary? Why so special? How did it create its unique brand of horror? And how has that changed over the years? With Resident Evil 9 hopefully on the horizon, I want to take a look back and deep dive into how Resident Evil built its horror and cemented itself as the king of the survival horror genre. Back in 1996, Capcom released Resident Evil, a game that wasn't just a spiritual successor to Sweet Home, but the foundation for survival horror itself. Director Shinji Mikami had one goal: make players feel vulnerable. The game achieved this with a combination of fixed camera angles, tank controls, and limited ammo, forcing players to pick their battles carefully. Instead of fast, aggressive enemies, zombies moved slowly, but their sheer resilience and the awkwardness of movement made every encounter tense. Then there were the moments of pure horror, the infamous dog hallway scene, the first zombie slowly turning its head towards the player, the eerie silence that made every door you opened feel like a death sentence. Resident Evil 2 refined the formula, adding more variety in locations and enemies. Leon and Claire's dual campaigns provided a fresh dynamic, giving players different perspectives on the Raccoon City outbreak. The introduction of Lickers brought in a whole new type of enemy as well, that could stalk the players from the ceiling, adding even more tension to the exploration. Then came Resident Evil 3, which took terror to once again another level with Nemesis, a relentless stalker that could chase you through rooms, breaking the one safe mechanic players had relied on: doors. The ability to backtrack and change the game's story based on choices added a layer of replayability, making every playthrough feel slightly different. By the early 2000s, survival horror was struggling to maintain mainstream appeal, so Capcom took a risk with Resident Evil 4, and in doing so, they revolutionized not only their own franchise, but third-person shooters as a whole. Gone were the fixed camera angles. Now, players had over-the-shoulder perspective that made aiming feel more precise, but also made encounters more intense. Instead of slow-moving zombies, you had the Ganados, who could dodge, flank, and rush you with weapons. The game still had horror, especially in areas like the Regenerator Labs, but it was also more action-oriented than ever before. Then came Resident Evil 5 and 6, which doubled down on action. RE5 introduced co-op gameplay, which, while fun, completely erased the isolation that made previous games terrifying. However, it still had tense moments, like fighting off waves of enemies while limited on ammo, or dealing with the horrifying Ouroboros creatures. The dynamic between Chris and Shiva made for an engaging but ultimately more action-heavy experience. By the time RE6 rolled around, it was full-on action blockbuster mode, with gunfights, explosions, and an absurd amount of quick-time events, with multiple campaigns featuring Leon, Chris, Jake, and Ada. Capcom aimed to please everyone, but the result was a bloated experience that divided fans. Was it still horror? Well, that depended on which campaign you played. Leon's story had classic horror elements, while Chris and Jake's were straight-up action games. While these games were still enjoyable, many fans felt that Resident Evil had lost its horror roots, and Capcom took notice. In 2017, Capcom brought Resident Evil back to its terrifying origins with Resident Evil 7. The biggest change? A first-person perspective. This was a major risk, but it allowed for a new kind of immersive horror, one that pulled from modern indie games like Amnesia and Outlast. Gone were the gunfights against horde of enemies. Instead, you were trapped in a decrepit house with the Baker family, who felt more human and terrifying than any other BOW before them. Every creaking floorboard, every flickering light, it all built up a level of dread that the series hadn't seen in years. The sheer unpredictability of Jack Baker breaking through the walls and hunting you through the house added an anxiety-inducing tension that never really let up. Then came Resident Evil Village, which blended the horror of RE7 and the action of RE4. The The game had terrifying moments like the grotesque baby monster in the house of Beneviento, but also introduced larger-than-life villains like Lady D and more combat-heavy sections. It was a mix of both eras of Resident Evil, and for the most part, it worked. The more open-ended areas allowed for deeper exploration, and the various horror themes in different sections gave players a variety of scares. Now, it's impossible to talk about horror gaming without at least mentioning Resident Evil's influence. Without Resident Evil, we wouldn't have Silent Hill psychological horror, Dead Space's limb-cutting combat, or The Evil Within, which was literally created by Shinji Mikami as a spiritual successor. Even indie horror games like Amnesia and Outlast owe something to Resident Evil's ability to make the player feel powerless. The series created the blueprint: limited resources, tight level design, and a balance of action and horror. And if you enjoyed the video, please feel free to leave a like and consider subscribing to stick around for more videos just like this. We recently hit 700 subscribers, which is crazy, guys. I can't thank you guys enough. I'm having so much fun just talking about the things I love with y'all and hearing the experiences y'all have with the topics I talk about. Uploads are coming out at 3 p.m. EST every single Monday, and hopefully I'll see you there next week. So, until next time, it has been your boy Katana. Peace.